Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, all about incident categorisation and prioritisation, sponsored by TechExcel. I'll hand over shortly to your presenter for today, Ollie O'Donoghue, who's industry analyst here at SDI. He'll be starting us off with some slides and then a bit of discussion, and he'll be joined later on by SDI associate Tony Ranson, who will continue the discussion. And before I hand over to Ollie, just to remind everybody listening, please post your questions for today's presenters at any time during the webinar, and we'll come to those towards the end of the session. So Ollie, it's over to you.
Thank you, Zoe. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Zoe pointed out, I'll be joined by Tony Ranson, who's an SDI associate, shortly. We've been on quite a few audits with each other over the last year, and I think instant categorisation and prioritisation is one that comes up an awful lot. So this is a really great webinar to have. So I think first of all, if we just take a look at what instant categorisation actually is, this is a definition I came up kind of amalgamating a few other different definitions, including the SDC one. So instant categorisation is the process of collecting a group of similar incident types together with the objective to ensure effective lifecycle visibility and to deliver valuable reporting outputs. Really, it's sort of a process that's almost forgotten about, but it hinges on an awful lot of other areas that are really important, such as service level management and problem management. Without good quality instant categorisation, problem management can become increasingly difficult. I think what we'll do is, if we have a look at the SDC descriptions, this is something that I think me and Tony know off by heart by now, which is the Service Desk Certification Standard 5.08, which is about categorisation. And right at the top there we've got the definition, very similar to my previous one, and the various levels of maturity. So at a reactive level, there's just a defined procedure for incident and service request categorisation. Obviously today we'll be focusing on the incident categorisation. At a proactive level, that procedure is documented, routinely followed and regularly maintained, so people kind of look at it and make sure it's an efficient process. At the third level, this one's really important, so the procedure allows for changing the category of open incidents and service requests during the life cycle of an incident. So that's important because at a logging stage, we might not always get it right. We take a look at some of the symptoms, we analyse the incident and we categorise it appropriately, but sometimes new information comes to light that means we need to recategorise that throughout the life cycle of the incident. And the final aspect of that is the business-led level of maturity, which includes the separation of logging, which is impact and resolution. So we know a category at impact as the calls progress, as the incidents progressed and is resolved, there is a separate category that identifies the resolution. So I mean, if we take a look at why it's important, again, like I mentioned at the start, I think instant categorisation often takes a bit of a back seat and isn't given the attention it deserves. So it's important because it facilitates the creation of knowledge relevant to service desk incidents. And this is achieved by the service desk matching instant resolution categories, so analysts can use those resolutions in the future. So if there's a group of categories with a specific resolution that's been identified, then that resolution might save analysts a lot of time in the future if it's added to a knowledge management system. It ensures training initiatives meet business demand. This makes sense if you've got loads of categories, a specific category that's causing loads of calls. Service desks have a specific training budget. There's always a drive to do more with less, so it makes sense for training initiatives to target that category, to do as much as you can with it, and I think that's something me and Tony will be talking about quite a bit later on. It assists in locating bottlenecks in the support structure. So if you've got a specific type of category that follows a journey, and that journey takes longer than it should do, the call categorisation, the instant categorisation helps highlight that and highlights where that bottleneck is to improve the service and the incident life cycle. Innovations such as automation in service management tools can be supported by categorisation. Again, that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. Categorisation is perfect for automation, and we will be delving into that. Facilitating continual service improvement through targeting strengths and weaknesses is another area. Tony's got a lot of really good thoughts, since we talked about this an awful lot in some of the audits we've been in. So it's all about kind of looking at which categories are causing us the most bother, feeding those into problem management, or working to drive down the impact those categories have on the service we provide. And that's linked to supporting the problem management process. So I think I'd like to introduce Tony Ranson at this stage. So hello, Tony.
Hi, Ollie. Hello, everybody.
So we're going to take, I think we're going to take a positive approach to begin with. And we're going to be looking at the do's and don'ts of incident categorization. I think we'll start off with the do's. So we'll be nice positive. But I don't know if have I missed anything out from the what's important, Tony? I usually have.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that I'd like to add to that, Ollie, and it's very much around the fact that once you do categorization, what you're doing is creating an amazing opportunity for data mining your database to actually review where you can get the best impact in terms of improving customer satisfaction, as well as increasing the speed to resolution. And of course what that means is, at the end of the day, reducing the backlog of outstanding calls and the benefits that gives to just about everybody around in the system.
Fantastic, thanks, Tony. A wonderful addition to why it's important. So we'll like I said, we'll start off with the positive things. We'll have a look at the do's of incident categorization. I think we'll be moving on to the prioritization aspect a little bit later on in the webinar. So first of all, the do's. So this is something I highlighted in a recent research report I did for our members, which is collaboration and input from all stakeholders. So do you think this is something we see a lot of, Tony, this level of collaboration and discussion?
Sadly, it's not something that we see prevalent all the time. It varies from organisation to organisation, and I must say that it also varies very much, quite dramatically, between the sizes of organisations. So the larger organisations tend to invest a bit more in terms of getting categorisation to work and be meaningful for them. The smaller ones probably don't put quite as much effort and thought in, and very often do not discuss at the top level of the organisation, you know, the senior management team, first of all, to decide what the strategy is for the organisation, what it wants from the categorisation process. So I think it all begins with getting that involvement of the senior management team, defining where the strategy fits with categorisation, and then cascading it down through the various levels of management and all of the resolver teams, as well as the service desk. And I guess the most important element as well is that we need to talk to our customers as well, because let's face it, at the end of the day, we're here as IC service and support and the service desk generally to keep the business running. And so if we don't ask our customers what they need from us in terms of being able to fix long outstanding problems and actually fix very often the very large quantities of a particular kind of incident that we get, then actually we'll never get it right for them. So consulting them once we've got the strategy in place is quite an important step forward.
Yes, I mean that's really interesting. So before I joined the Service Desk Institute, I was an analyst, and I think an aspect of that collaboration and certainly getting customers involved that's often missed is that the customers are the ones that are describing the symptoms to us. They're at that first stage, so if we can get them involved in creating those categories, then it's going to be an awful lot easier for the analysts to be able to identify which category meets the symptoms for the customer. So it's really good to get that collaboration right from the customer all the way out to the senior leadership team.
Yeah, and I think what I'd like to add to that, Ollie, is we've got to remember that with the passage of time, things change, and the one thing that we can guarantee in IT support and the service desk and our resolver team support is that actually change is going to be a constant. And so it doesn't just end with, hey, we've done some consultation, we've talked and gained an idea about what's important to the organisation in terms of categorisation, but that we consistently do it again and again and again. Because even if you leave it 12 months, typically in an IT organisation, a 12-month period is like a lifetime for many other departments and organisations in a company. So change, being this constant, needs to be consistently reviewed by those stakeholders again to make sure with the passage of time we keep up with the evolution of our products and services.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So I think, I mean, that's quite a top level look, isn't it, at that level of collaboration. So I think if we go down to the nitty gritty, and these, I think when we're auditing, these are the aspects that people talk about the most, aren't they? So if we go to these three, so if we start off with how many categories should we have? So what's your insight there, Tony?
Okay, well that's really interesting, because again, we go around and we see a lot of organisations when we're doing service desk certification audits, and what we see very often is that organisations create dozens of different categories, and from that, those dozens of different categories create up to hundreds of different actual
subcategories
and also codes, yeah, so the coding behind it. And of course what that means is, very often you see these organisations that have gone to the lengths of producing great long lists, which they've probably produced and put into a binder or a little black book for analysts, and it becomes very meaningless, because of course what tends to happen then is the analysts focus on their favourites, and they might have a top 10 that they like, and they might have, of that 10, 5 of them that they consistently use the most, and they repeat that regardless, because it's too difficult to actually drill down for them to actually locate in a very busy organisation the kind of category that would actually relate. So I think if you haven't got categorisation in place and you're about to put it in, the one thing that you really need to do is take a sort of softly approach, so that you actually catch the monkey and get them on board very quickly. And of course monkeys are curious people, and actually so are our customers. They need to know, and that's what's important. So if we provide too many of these category codes and too many category levels, then of course their need to know is actually not being made effectively.
Excellent, excellent. So I mean, I know it's difficult to say, and obviously it depends on the business, but if you were to put a number, so we're talking the very top level category, so I've got the example there on the slide, which is software, and I think that's quite a conventional one to have: software, hardware, servers, that type of thing. So if you had to put a figure on the top categories, how many do you think people should have?
Well, it really does relate specifically to the business concerned, and we do need to understand that we need to know what the business is looking from this kind of categorisation. But generally speaking, if you go from a rule of thumb of around 2 to 5 categories at the top level, you'd probably find that most things will fit in that and enable you to drill down to subcategories below it.
Yes, I mean that leads us on to our next one, is that so we've got these kind of fairly broad top categories, which is absolutely reasonable. So how many subcategories should we have to make sure that we get that kind of granular information that we need when we're reporting and managing problems?
And again, it's not a general rule, but as a rule of thumb, you could talk about the same quantity again, 2 to 5. And if you start thinking about, hey, that don't sound very many, once you start to expand it through a grid of actually demonstrating what codes you need through those levels, you're talking in excess of 100 different codes that people would be using along the way.
Yeah, and of course there's the risk that you identified to begin with. Is if you have too many, people just go to their favourites. I certainly know I did when I was an analyst. I hope my previous employer isn't listening. So I mean, this is one that comes up an awful lot, and I've heard it, and I'm sure I've heard it with you when we've been out auditing. Should any of these be mandatory? So at what level should analysts have to categorise?
Certainly, I believe that at the top level it's a mandatory operation. Yes, it's category 1. That top level, you need to make sure that all of those are recorded and never missed. And then at the next level down, the subcategory, again, you need to be able to do that. Once you get to category 3, it may not be so relevant to make it actually a mandatory requirement to drill down, because it may well be that at the subcategory level, the first subcategory level, is wide enough to describe an application suite, for instance, or a particular system or infrastructure component.
Yeah, so I think that's in the example on the slide there. We've got software, Microsoft Office, Excel. So that second category should be mandatory, but actually that could easily cover the whole issue. The whole of Microsoft Office is down. So Excel is an excellent piece of additional information, but may not necessarily need to be mandatory.
No, absolutely. But of course, we've always got to remember that the output from these systems, and from our service management system in particular, it's collecting this information, is only going to be as good as the data we put into it. And of course, if we don't make those first two levels mandatory, then actually you can't rely on the output that you generate from reports.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got, this is the final one of the do's. So and I think this is perhaps one that we don't often see done at all, really, which is maintenance and retirement. So what advice would you give to organisations about maintenance and retirement?
This is probably the hardest part of categorisation, because once you've set it up and established it, people think, hey, that's the end of the project and we haven't got any more to do except use it. And of course that's not true, because as things change with the passage of time, there'll be systems that drop off that you never provide support for, and it will just confuse the issue, because if you're doing analysis and you're doing any kind of charting of what categories are the most prevalent right the way down through which are the least prevalent, you will get spurious systems being logged and spurious applications being logged, which maybe only one or two people use throughout the organisation, and it will distort the picture of what you're trying to achieve. So the real trick is to keep the information up to date and live, and so what we need to do with this is on a pretty regular basis review to see which ones have not been used and find out why, and then make a judgment as to whether we retire them or whether we just put them into a wider category, a slightly broader category, for instance. And of course what that means is someone somewhere has got to do the review, and who better to do the review than a small maintenance committee to actually be set up to actually spend some dedicated time amongst the stakeholders to actually make sure that the categories are still right for the organisation and the way the organisation is developing. So I think the establishment of a small committee, not a big committee by any means, to actually come in and look probably round about quarterly at what's actually happening to those codes would be a great place to start.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard from some service desks that specific categories have been added by perhaps, like, say, a business applications team, and although nobody's logging any instance against them, they're very kind of dedicated to keeping that category open. Do you think that there's a case we said that you'd then go to that team and say, like, either we're going to retire this category or you're going to need to offer our analysts the training they need to be able to identify which symptoms
Absolutely,
because
this is all part of the CSI process, isn't it? Continuous service improvement needs a catalyst or an input to actually say this is where we've got weakness, and of course if we've got categories that aren't being used even though that they've been recently introduced, then either we're on top of the service and actually the product or service is totally reliable, or people just don't understand that it is a specific output of another kind of symptom, and so the analysts need training to recognise those sort of features and deal with it accordingly.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're gonna shift over to the don'ts now, and I think we've got a similar amount of these. So the first one is one that I can remember from my experience as an analyst, and again it's something that is all over the place, I think, in this industry, is having a category that's either other or miscellaneous. And I think the reason behind this is, whenever I've asked, is that there is sometimes a grey area between a category that we've defined and kind of no category at all, so it doesn't really fit in any. So service desks have these miscellaneous and other categories, and there's a bit of a danger in that, isn't there, Tony?
Oh, it's extremely dangerous use of this kind of category. I think first of all we ought to destroy and tear up and throw away anything with the label miscellaneous on. I quite like other, yeah, because it does describe maybe an opportunity to consider additional categories which would be then reviewed by that review committee that we were talking about a few minutes before. But at the end of the day, if you have other and you don't control its use very well, then it will become a favourite with analysts who simply can't be bothered to drill down and find the right or appropriate category in things that are maybe not so obvious or so prevalent, and they come across unusually. So we really need to make sure that from the use of other should really invoke another mandatory requirement, which is to say, hey, what is it? Describe it in full, in free text, so that people can then consider this for further inclusion.
It's interesting. So in that process, if an analyst selects other, they have to identify why it didn't fit into another category, perhaps identify a potential future category, and this committee that we're talking about, this collaboration group, would then decide whether or not there are enough of these free text to create another category.
That's absolutely right. And of course, you'll also need to monitor the use of other, because it may simply be that it becomes the popular choice whenever there's either a major incident going on, or the desk is very busy and has got abnormal workloads, and so it's easier and quicker to stick it in other rather than actually identify where it really goes.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for that, Tony. So we've got the next one, which is broad categorization. So I think this is really about, so we mentioned this briefly when we were looking at subcategories. So it's having something like software and then perhaps underneath operating system as the two mandatory categories. And obviously a lot of things can be applied to operating system. In fact, pretty much all applications, I think, I would be able to identify perhaps as being an issue with the operating system. So what do you think are the risks there?
Look, the biggest risk, of course, is that when we do get the output from the analysis of all this data, that actually it's not meaningful enough for you to either decide what actions to take on a CSI initiative, or indeed whether any action should be taken and in what direction, because it's just not meaningful in terms of, we don't know from a statistical point of view which elements could be causing this kind of issue.
Yeah, and I guess the big one's problem management, isn't it? So if you've got these broad categories, how are you able to identify whether or not something's a problem?
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't simplify the process of just simply alerting problem management to say, hey, by the way, did everybody know that we had 3,000 incidents of Outlook this month, and why would that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and do you think that's something that can be resolved by more mandatory subcategories, or just narrowing down those categories at a higher level?
Tightening them up at the high level is really significant, and really is the only way you're going to achieve this kind of meaningful manipulation of data.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so our next one, and I've put these together, and these are sort of the inverse of the do's, really. So the first one is avoiding consultation and collaboration with stakeholders, which I think we've identified as a bit of an issue, actually, whenever it comes to instant categorization. And then this is one that we see an awful lot of, which is making instant categorization just a service desk activity.
Yeah.
So what are the risk areas there, do you think?
Well, again, if very often we find that we forget that the systems, the infrastructure, the applications, all of these devices that we provide support on actually are there to enable the business and keep the business running effectively. And so if that means that we don't speak to our customers and actually talk with them collaboratively about these kind of issues, then actually we won't be giving them the right kind of support services to actually make sure that the business does run effectively, bearing in mind that we're simply the caretakers of these operations. And if we don't understand what's important and what's meaningful to them, then it's very difficult for us to do that, and we'll take an IT view of it, which isn't necessarily anything aligned to the business opportunity.
Okay, I mean, do you think it's easy for that? So that I feel like the service desk is really interested in instant categorization. I'm not 100% sure what other IT teams think about it. So is it the case that the service desk should drive this collaboration, and then hopefully all the other teams will tag on? Do you think they're already interested?
Yeah, I actually think, Ollie, that this is a really important aspect, because for those organisations that put this in, if they haven't got the buy-in properly at the resolver team level, then what tends to happen is you start to see a ping-pong effect amongst the incidents that are being logged and acted upon. And what that means is maybe the resolver team might look at this incident and say, hey, this is the wrong categorisation, service desk should know better, and they bounce the call back. And of course, that does nothing for the analysts' credibility and their morale, but worse, the effect it has on the customer is a delaying tactic while that gets sorted. And really we have to be careful to avoid that when we put categorisation into the incident management process, and make sure that we've got the buy-in right from the beginning of all of those resolver teams to ensure customer satisfaction is actually enhanced rather than reduced.
Wonderful, excellent. Okay, and just the final one for the don'ts here, which is, and again, I think this is something that we see an awful lot of, which is ignoring the outcomes. So we've got a couple of examples there, such as reporting value, training requirements, and business decision making. Sometimes I think both of us have got the impression that instant categorisation is done just because it needs to be done. Perhaps it's something that's built into the tool and people make use of at the time. And there isn't a specific outcome that people are looking for, so they're not looking for any reporting value, they're not looking to identify any training requirements, and you know, there's no real business decision making made as a result. So what's kind of the solution to that?
I think you need regular distribution of reports and statistics that actually stack up behind the actual report. And I think one of the things that we often neglect is the fact that we've identified who to actually send these reports to so that it can affect their actual decision in terms of not just CSI initiatives but actually supporting business decision making. And so we need to be very careful when producing reports that actually people read them and that they find that they've got a use which is applicable to that particular department or resolver team or even customer group. So at the end of the day, what we should see is some very effective problem management increases and some very effective CSI activity coming straight out of the outcome of using categories successfully.
Lovely, excellent, thanks. So it's making that outcome focus the centre of everything that goes on. Excellent. Okay, so I think we're gonna quick jump over to instant prioritisation now. So again, this is a brief definition here. So it's a process to identify the relative importance of an incident based on impact and urgency to ensure the effective allocation to and utilisation of support resources. It's another one that comes up an awful lot for us, isn't it, Tony? And we do end up kind of talking about it throughout any audit process or any event that we're going through.
Absolutely.
And here's the service desk certification standards. This is the one that we use when we're out on audit. And we've got the different levels of maturity there. So reactive is the defined procedure. Proactive is the procedure is documented. This is where it kind of gets really interesting, is the customer-led stuff. So the procedure allows the priority levels of open instance and service requests to be changed. So why do you think that's important?
Again, you know, right at the beginning of the incident, our analysts actually do some diagnosis, listen and try to capture the problem identity or the problem statement, if you like. And from there, that's not always correct. And sometimes our customers cry wolf a little, for want of a better word, you know, and we know who those guys are that cry wolf, but at the end of the day they're always saying, hey, it's a priority one, it's always ASAP, it's always urgent, those kind of things. And you know, until we can actually substantiate whether they're right or wrong, the analyst has to go with what the customer's telling them to a degree. And so we should be able to, during the course of the call, if we determine that, hey, it's not actually a priority one call, for example, but it's actually a lesser priority, maybe a 2, maybe a 3, we should be able to change that accordingly if we haven't got the flexibility in our system to just accommodate that and soak up the fact that it's wrong without affecting legitimate other higher priority instance. The other problem, of course, is the fact that what actually tends to happen is if we've got too many high priority incidents that aren't really a high priority, we'll find that we'll treat them with maybe a lower respect because we identified that they're not really as real as it first appear. And of course that will change the statistics that we get out of our system. And you might think that's not particularly relevant, but of course priority 1 incidents are not exactly at the most highest level, and so they are far fewer in terms of quantity priority incidents in a month if your systems are working along the way you actually design them to work. And of course what that means is if we've got a higher level than what's expected, we're bound to miss them in terms of missing our targets and our expectations for our customer. And of course that will have a dramatic input in terms of customer satisfaction, and you'll see a drop in their satisfaction activity.
Fantastic. I mean, what you've done there is touched upon kind of that final level of maturity, that business-led level of maturity, which is service level performance is tracked and reported by priority. So obviously high priority calls tend to have their own service level agreement, and what you're saying is if it's too easy to log a high priority call, then that's going to be impacted. We're going to miss our SLAs on those, and obviously it's just not fair on other customers.
Absolutely right.
Wonderful, thank you. So here, I got into a bit of trouble with Tony with this one. So this is a priority matrix, and it's based on the kind of the traditional impact and urgency. So if you look at the bottom there, we've got the brightly coloured from kind of yellow to red. So widespread, critical is that kind of impact and urgency. And you raised an interesting point, Tony, which was that it's missing something, isn't it?
Well, desperately missing something. You know, basically it's assuming that all of our critical incidents are going to be applicable to a widespread effect of like a major incident, for example. And unfortunately that's not going to be reflective of specific kinds of users, and those specific kinds of users could be a single user who is, say, working from home. Maybe that single user, as an example, would be a care worker supporting childcare, and actually their inability to log on at home would actually stop them working, would prevent care from happening systematically and consistently, and of course would be justified by the fact that, hey, it's just one user with one specific problem, and whilst it's got a very high impact to them in terms of being able to assign a priority 1 to it, it would be negated. So we need to do something much more fundamental to ensure that single users with a critical situation are recognised and able to be recorded and acted on accordingly.
Yeah, so interestingly in this example, this matrix, we've got localised, limited, large and widespread, so that would be a localised issue with the example you've given. Mm-hmm. So even if it's identified as of critical urgency, it's only going to get high prioritisation instead of critical. Right. So what is there a solution to this? Like I say, this is a traditional impact versus urgency calculation. Is there a way around that we can reflect severity, I think was the word you used?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, very often we see when we go around various service desks that actually they've determined and added into their service management system a severity code box, and it can be a simple tick field that enables the analyst to say, hey, this is, whilst it's recognised as it's a local or limited category that we need to respond to it as a very high priority, it's not just a high priority. But putting it across in the severity box would actually say the analyst is okay to actually understand that issue, decide that it really is the issue that requires a critical response.
So there would be elements of moderation around that, presumably, because I think it would be really easy. So as a former analyst, I want the best for my customers to mark everyone as high severity, which is counterproductive.
Crafty but counterproductive. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the way that would normally be controlled, I think, is very much through the incident management process and the incident management team, if you've got one. If you haven't got an incident management team that's dedicated to incident management, you would expect the service desk manager to actually be hot on the case. And so what you'd need to achieve from that is that every single time the severity code box was used, you would send an auto email to him to say, hey, we've got this particular situation, it's an anomaly, but it needs understanding.
Excellent. Okay, so I mean we've touched on priorities there, and I think we'll quickly move on to kind of our final area, which is looking at the future. So here at the Service Desk Institute, we're always trying to be forward-facing, look to the future, see what's coming up around the corner. And I think in categorization and prioritization, there's a lot of automation and integration going on, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. It's being developed the whole time, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, a specific example, I think this is something we talk about quite regularly, is that now you can categorize a call. So let's say server-related call as a server issue, and it will zip straight off to the server management team without touching the service desk.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that's really important, isn't it? Because that frees our service desk up to actually take more calls, to do other work, like work on outstanding incidents and those kind of things. And of course, it saves the server manager from shooting the team in the foot, because actually we've spent too much time trying to diagnose server issues which are not the remit of the service desk.
Excellent. Okay. And so, do you think there's anything about prioritization going on in terms of automation and integration?
Absolutely. I mean, if you've got this level of service management system, you can actually ensure that a system can dial home, and actually by dialing home it contacts the service management system, and it auto-populates a new incident for that server, and also alerts the incident management team or the person responsible for incident management, so that the high priority has happened again transparently, without service desk intervention and without time-wasting situations.
Yeah, so something, I mean, similar to that, something I've seen is that, say for example, through self-service, a complaint is logged. One of the first things that happens is an automated email is sent off to the service desk manager, incident manager, to get their attention. So do you think there's anything to it, if a call's marked as a high priority and is logged, and is categorized as a server issue, does an email go straight off to the server management team leader? Or?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital. And when you're talking about complaints, we've actually become a victim of our own success, and what we've got on our service desks these days are very much a nation of what I call Mr. and Mrs. Fix-It. And Mr. and Mrs. Fix-It are very, very keen, very, very focused on customers and getting resolutions for customers and getting them back to work quickly. And very often that means that as soon as a customer contacts them and says, hey, you know, this is the 15th occasion this week when I've had to actually have this situation dealt with by the service desk, actually they'll very merrily, as a group of individuals, go on their way to attempt to fix that for the customer, and they will get him back up and running very quickly. The one thing that they don't do, of course, is to actually recognise that 15 cases of incidents that, or categories of incidents, has actually occurred in that month or in that week. And so for them, you know, the solution was, let's fix it for this customer. But really, as an organisation, what we want is the realisation that as an organisation we've got 15 occurrences of a particular category of call, and so that intelligence shouldn't be lost, and so automating the complaint process can do that. And of course, empowering the analysts to actually be able to say and then learn to say, hey, you've had that 15 times, I'd like to log that for a complaint for you, would you like me to do that? That would be very empowering the organisation, but also it would mean so much more to the customer base, who would see us as very astute, very switched on, and very caring about resolution.
Excellent. I mean, are there any other processes, like, so we've had customer satisfaction and complaints processes supported by that? Are you aware of any other processes that are supported by automation integration in the categorization and prioritization area?
Yeah, it lends itself really, really well to actually a feed into knowledge management, and so we should be able to feed knowledge articles from the data that we've got on the service management system, because of the rate of reviewing whether the cause and effect codes for both categorization and resolution of incidents actually compare. And so you would get a lot quicker and a lot more advanced data into your knowledge management system as a result. And of course, all you've got to then do is use a moderator of some form to make sure that it's readable in English and it's not just looking like machine input.
Yeah. So I mean, that's an interesting one, because I think with knowledge management, some of the people I've been speaking to, I was at an event a short while ago, and it seems as though the actual creation and adding of knowledge into the knowledge management system is the hardest part. So if we can automate aspects of that, then we're already onto a winner. And I think there is another aspect of that I've seen, which is when an analyst identifies an incident as being under a certain category, the system will then prompt them with knowledge and say, or a template asking relevant questions for troubleshooting for the other team. So we are seeing that already in knowledge in service management tools.
Yeah. It's actually intuitive knowledge management, which is based on probability, and so again, the nicest thing I think about all this is that it's often more difficult to get our second line and third line resolver teams to create knowledge for the service desk to use, but using this kind of code and categorization process to feed knowledge management means that we'll get the kind of input that we need, because we're involving both groups, not just the service desk again.
Excellent. And I guess there's the aspect where there's no duplication of work, so the resolution has already been done, and then that resolution is carried off into the knowledge management system.
Absolutely right. And of course, the final piece on that is very much, it should then feed problem management, and it would also feed the CSI initiatives as well. So it's a big win-win situation all round.
Excellent. I mean, it's a great way to finish off, I think, on the importance of categorization, both kind of currently and for the future. So I think what's best now is if we go to questions, and I think we've got quite a few questions coming in. So if I take the first one, which is for urgent requests, how would you handle urgent requests in a categorization and prioritization process, and are there any risks? So I think with this question, is there any benefit to having a category specifically for urgent requests, or is that a danger?
I think there's a bit of a danger in terms of it really depends on what we're expecting our teams to provide in terms of the service levels that we're trying to support. So you have to be very careful that you don't create a code which will work adversely against the service level agreements that you've already committed to and agreed with your customers in the first place.
Right, excellent. Yeah, and I suppose that if from a reporting standpoint, all you're going to do with a category that says urgent call is know that there were loads of urgent calls. You don't really know
precisely
what was involved until you dig into the details.
Absolutely right.
So we've got another question here from Peter, which is I'm struggling with getting my customers motivated to change the categorization. Do you have any advice? So how do we get customers interested in something that, I guess, from their perspective, is something that should be handled by IT?
I think first and foremost is involve them in actually seeing some information that's generated from the system. So showing them that what the 10 or top 10 categories were this month and the pain that it caused by the volume, and then showing how by using categorization to focus on those top 10 kinds of incidents can actually reduce that effect very quickly and reduce the numbers of outstanding calls, then actually that will enhance user satisfaction, and they'll see that by you involving them in the categorization process, that they will see a value because they're talking about representing their business activity and what their needs are.
Excellent. So we're talking about kind of marketing, why it's important to them. So if they're calling up all the time with a specific category that we've identified, then they may see high first contact resolution rates, faster resolution, that type of thing. So it's marketing the value it has. So I mean, I guess inviting them into the service desk might be a good idea so they can see what goes on.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, don't forget to involve them in the review committee as well, because you've involved them at the beginning in defining some of the categorization, and now you really want to know about, with the passage of time, is that still important to them, the ones that they've specifically asked to have included.
Excellent. Okay. So we've got another question from Mark, which is thoughts on categorization by symptom. So we've talked about kind of categories that are, software, operating systems. So what's affected as a service or a piece of hardware? What about by symptom? So I'm trying to think of an example. So if we go software, operating system, blue screen, because that's one I remember from my analyst days was blue screen. I mean, that's actually not an ideal category because that's kind of an awful lot of things in Windows represents itself as a blue screen. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's the way to go? Do you think that would just be too difficult? You'd have to wait for things to break to get the symptom, wouldn't you?
That's precisely right. And of course the other thing is it's going to extend the number of category codes that you've got, and of course that means that the analyst may not be likely to actually find those symptoms very easily. And so I think we really got to be careful there, because if we're training and developing people properly, they're going to be taught about the product, about the services, and we should make sure that actually that the training courses are fit for the purpose.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I have seen a hybrid of service categorization and symptom categorization, with the symptoms not being mandatory. So it's going back to what we were talking about to begin with. So you'd have software operating system as mandatory, and then symptoms underneath that, which wouldn't be mandatory. So an analyst could say it's just an operating system, I can't see any symptoms at this stage, but you would have that blue screen, or I can't, do you know, honestly, it's been so long now since I've been an analyst, I can't remember any others. So there is the option, I think, to make it hybrid and add those symptoms as you go along, but yeah, I think you're right in that it would massively multiply the amount of categories available.
Yeah.
So if we just go for a final question, which is from Peter. We might have a couple more actually. So we've got one from Peter, who's from an internal service desk, who points out that the business is struggling to understand the buy-in required. So I think it's going back to that collaboration aspect. So that we've got that's a theme there from Peter, that so customers are struggling to get buy-in, and the business as a whole is trying to get buy-in. So I think it's sort of the same.
It really is, and again, sometimes, you know, our customers are not aware strategically of where we're going, even internally, and so really inviting them to that round of collaborative talks about what categorization can do for them, and focusing it very specifically in that area, you will improve that buy-in through consultation and discussion, really. It doesn't happen overnight, you know, I mean, Rome's never built in a day, is it? And of course we've got to keep repeating the messages. And I think, again, the monthly publication of reports about the categorization and the impact that it's having on the business is fundamental to getting this buying going. But very often we forget to copy our customers on this kind of information. But putting it somewhere like an intranet page that actually everybody can get to if they wish to, and then with gentle reminders that it's there, you will gradually improve that kind of buying and perception.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, we've actually got a comment from David here, which is really interesting. So it's regarding levels that are not mandatory. If it is optional, you can guarantee it won't get completed, which I can completely understand. Actually, I think we had a discussion about this a little while ago. So we were talking about mandatory categories and why not make them all mandatory. But I think the conclusion we came to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, is that there needs to be that level of analysis at an analyst stage. That's why they're called analysts, is that they can analyse the information. If we go back to that example of software, Microsoft Office, Excel, the two top levels are mandatory because software is too ambiguous, but Microsoft Office itself could have fallen over completely. So drilling down to Excel will give a blinkered image of what's really affected. So everyone will think Excel's always the problem because alphabetically it's right at the top.
That's right.
Whereas it might just be Microsoft Office that's always at fault. So have you got anything to add to that? Or?
No, I think I totally support that view that we have to be very careful, and I really do believe that he's absolutely right. You know? At the end of the day, you know, if people don't have to do it, they won't. Yeah. So it's all about empowerment at the end of the day. So again, it's no good just sending your analysts an email, and telling them they got to do this. You've actually got to explain it, discuss it, talk about it, cajole, police, and enforce. And so it's all of those activities working together to make them feel empowered enough to actually deal with it.
Excellent. Okay, so I think this really is the final question. We've had some, an awful lot of really good questions, and I think what we're going to do is, to answer the rest of them, is do a blog. I think me and Tony are going to collaborate on a blog after the webinar and hopefully answer as many of those as we can. But if we finish off with Steve's question, which is, would you recommend 3 levels of categorization rather than 2, using critical incidents from the CMDB for 3rd level? So, I mean, I think at the start we were talking about between 2 and 5, weren't we? Yeah. Between 2 and 5. So there's definitely got some merits there of using those critical incidents from the configuration management database to provide a kind of intelligence and insight on what should be in that 3rd level.
Sure.
But I think ultimately it's got to be what provides the outcome. So it's going back to that outcome focus, isn't it? So if we want to use the configuration management database to provide insight on that 3rd level, brilliant. If it's going to provide that reporting and help us provide that better service.
Yeah, the key word is whether it helps us and it helps the business.
Yeah.
Because if it's coming out of CMDB at the 3rd level, maybe it's not that critical in terms of volume, yeah, and so the effort that you put in to actually do that may not be as valuable as you first think.
Yeah, no, I think perhaps that's one that we'll try and go into a little bit more depth in a blog, perhaps, because it is an interesting question, and it does take in, all of the information that we have available to us. So in the CMDB, what our customers are telling us, and involving all of that at the initial categorization level. Okay, fantastic. So I think that's all we have time for at the moment. So thank you, Tony, for joining me. It's great having a chat to you.
Oh, yeah, most welcome.
Thank you to everyone who listened, and of course thank you to TechExcel for sponsoring this webinar.